The silence that came after the sirens. The street looked ordinary again by morning, and that was the most unsettling part. The police cars were gone. The flashing lights that had painted the houses red and blue through the night had disappeared as if they had never existed. The asphalt was dry. The curbs were clean. Only a faint indentation in the grass hinted that something heavy had stood there for hours. In Briarwood Glen, mornings usually arrived with the sound of sprinklers and early commuters. This one arrived with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses down on the chest. Curtains shifted behind windows. Neighbors watched without stepping outside. A man watering his lawn paused, then turned the hose off halfway through, as if noise itself felt inappropriate. No one asked questions out loud. Everyone already knew that something had gone wrong, and that knowing more might come with a cost. Inside a small beige house at the end of the block, Ruth Carter sat alone on her couch. At 62, her hands no longer shook easily. They had learned steadiness through decades of factory work, raising a son alone, and surviving a world that never slowed down for women like her. But this morning, her fingers trembled around her phone as if it were too heavy to hold. The television glowed across the living room, its sound turned low. A local news anchor spoke in measured tones, careful and detached, the way people speak when they are afraid of saying the wrong thing. A still image filled the screen. Her son's face. Marcus Carter, 38, city maintenance worker. A photo pulled from somewhere online taken years ago at a family barbecue. He was smiling in it, wearing a faded baseball cap, holding a paper plate with ribs and corn. It was not a mugshot, but the caption beneath it made no such distinction. Ruth leaned forward, squinting as if getting closer might change what she was seeing. "They don't even know him," she whispered to the empty room. The anchor continued. Overnight, an officer was killed during a late-night incident in a residential neighborhood. Authorities confirm that a local resident is currently being held for questioning. Details remain limited. Limited. That word landed harder than any accusation. Ruth's phone vibrated. Then again. Missed calls. Unknown numbers. A voicemail notification blinked, but she did not open it. She already knew what it would sound like. Voices asking for comments, for statements, for reactions, for permission to turn her life into a headline. She muted the television and sat back, staring at the framed photos lining the wall. Marcus, at 8 years old, missing 2 front teeth. Marcus in his high school graduation gown, eyes wide with pride and disbelief. Marcus standing in this very room just last week, kissing her cheek on his way out, saying he would call later. He never did. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past slowly, the driver glancing at the house before looking away. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then stopped. The world was moving again, just not for her. Ruth picked up the phone and finally opened the voicemail. A man's voice filled the room, calm and professional. "Mrs. Carter, this is Detective Harris with the county. We need to ask you a few questions regarding your son. Please return this call as soon as possible. Regarding your son, not asking if she was okay, not asking if she needed anything, just questions." She set the phone down carefully as if it might break. On the television, the image changed. Footage of the street from above, taken by a helicopter sometime in the night. The camera lingered on the area in front of her house, blurred just enough to hide details, sharp enough to make it clear where it was. The anchor added one more line, almost as an afterthought. Officials emphasized there is no ongoing threat to the public. Ruth let out a short, hollow laugh. No threat to the public, just to families like hers. She stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back an inch. Across the street, Mrs. Lowell from next door froze when their eyes met, then slowly closed her blinds. Ruth did not feel anger, only a dull confirmation of something she had known her entire life. When trouble comes, it never belongs to everyone. It chooses. On the coffee table, her phone buzzed again. This time, a text message from a number she recognized. "You watching the news?" She did not reply, because she was watching something else now. The way the room felt smaller, the way the air itself seemed to wait, the way her son's name was already being shaped by voices that had never spoken to him. Somewhere beyond her walls, decisions were being made, reports were being written, statements were being prepared, procedures were being followed. The system was awake. Ruth lowered the curtain and turned back to the room, pressing her hand against her chest, steadying her breath. She didn't know it yet, but whatever happened last night had already chosen who would suffer the most. If you follow the rules, you'll be safe. Marcus Carter had built his life around one simple belief. If you did things the right way, the world would leave you alone. He wasn't naive. He was careful. Careful in the way men become when they grow up watching how quickly situations change for people who look like them. Careful in the way that comes from learning early which mistakes you're allowed to make and which ones you aren't. Every morning started the same. Marcus pulled on his city-issued work shirt, the blue fabric already faded from years of washing, the name Carter stitched in white above the pocket. He laced his boots by the door while his mother moved quietly through the kitchen, the radio humming low with early news and gospel ads. "You got your badge?" Ruth asked without turning around. He tapped his chest. "Always." The badge didn't give him authority. It gave him legitimacy, or at least, that's what he believed. Marcus drove an old silver sedan with a cracked dashboard and a trunk that rattled over bumps. It wasn't flashy. That was the point. Flashy invited questions. Flashy invited assumptions. He liked things that didn't draw attention. On his way to work, he stopped at the same gas station every morning. Same pump. Same burnt coffee. Same cashier who nodded at him without small talk. He paid in cash, took the cup, and stood for a moment outside, watching traffic roll past like it had places to be. That's how he lived, observing, waiting, staying in his lane. Once, while leaning against his car, he'd been joined by his friend Darnell. Same age, same neighborhood, different outlook. You ever notice, Darnell said, eyeing a police cruiser across the street, how they never stop looking? Marcus shrugged. "They're just doing their job." Darnell laughed softly. "That's what you tell your son, too." Marcus didn't answer right away. He took a sip of coffee and grimaced at the taste. "When Jamal rides with me," he finally said, "I tell him what my father told me. Don't argue. Keep your hands visible. Say, 'Yes, sir. Come home.'" Darnell shook his head. "Man, it doesn't work that way for us." Marcus met his eyes. "It has to." That was the difference between them. Darnell saw a system stacked against him. Marcus saw a system that could be navigated if you were careful enough. At night, after work, Marcus helped his son with homework at the kitchen table. Math problems, reading assignments, lessons that felt safe, predictable. One evening, Jamal asked him, "Dad, why do you always slow down when you see police?" Marcus paused, then answered honestly, "Because being calm keeps things from getting complicated, even if you didn't do anything wrong." Marcus smiled tightly, especially then. He didn't tell his son the part that lived beneath that advice, the part he never said out loud, that the fear wasn't of being hurt, it was of being misunderstood, of watching someone decide who you are before you ever open your mouth, of becoming guilty in someone else's eyes in a matter of seconds. That night, Marcus drove home later than usual. A long shift, a loose wire downtown. The streetlights flickered as he turned onto the main road, radio low, windows down just enough to let the heat escape. He was thinking about nothing important. Dinner, rent, whether Jamal had finished his reading. Then he saw it in his rearview mirror, a sudden wash of blue. The reflection filled the car, flashing once, sharp and unmistakable. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel, not in panic, but in habit. He checked his speed, signaled, pulled to the side. As the light continued to pulse behind him, Marcus took a slow breath, straightened in his seat, and placed both hands carefully on the wheel, exactly where they could be seen. The moment he tried to stay on the road was almost empty, the kind of quiet stretch that felt louder at night than it ever did during the day. Marcus eased his car onto the shoulder and shifted into park. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, each sound suddenly noticeable in the still air. The blue light behind him continued to pulse, slow and deliberate, washing the inside of his car in brief flashes that made his rearview mirror feel like an accusation. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, high, visible, still, just like he had taught Jamal. In the side mirror, he saw the officer step out of the cruiser. White male, mid-40s, broad shoulders, calm stride, the kind of walk that suggested this was routine. Another stop, another night. Officer Daniel Reed approached slowly, hand resting near his belt, flashlight angled down, then up, then down again. His face stayed neutral, but his eyes moved constantly, scanning the car. The interior, Marcus himself. "Evening," Reed said. His voice was firm but not raised. "Professional, controlled." Marcus swallowed. "Evening, sir." The flashlight paused on Marcus's hands. "License and registration." "Yes, sir." Marcus spoke carefully, keeping his tone even. He did not reach right away. He had learned that lesson early. "My wallet's in my back pocket," he said. "Registration's in the glove box. Is it okay if I reach for them?" There was a brief pause. "Go ahead." Marcus moved slowly, deliberately. He felt the weight of every second, the way time seemed to stretch when you were aware of being watched. His fingers brushed the edge of his wallet. He brought it out, then reached for the glove box. The silence between them grew thicker. Reed glanced into the back seat. "You headed somewhere tonight?" "Home," Marcus said. "Just got off work." "What kind of work?" "City maintenance, electrical." Reed nodded slightly, but his eyes didn't soften. "You know why I stopped you?" Marcus shook his head. "No." "Sir?" Reed looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, not rushed, just measuring. "You were driving a little slow back there," Reed said. "Looked like you were watching your mirrors more than the road." Marcus let out a quiet breath. "Just trying to be careful." Careful usually doesn't look nervous. The word landed heavier than it should have. Marcus felt the urge rise in his chest to explain, to clarify, to say something that would make this make sense. He pushed it down. "Yes, sir," he said instead. Reed's eyes flicked up at that. Something changed, subtle but real, not hostility, suspicion. "You always this quiet?" Marcus hesitated, a second too long. "I'm just trying not to make things worse," he said. The words were meant to calm, to show cooperation, to say, "I know the rules." But Reed heard something else. "Worse," he repeated. "Why would things get worse?" Marcus realized, too late, how it sounded. "I didn't mean," he began, then stopped himself. He chose silence. In that moment, he believed silence was safer than correction. That explaining might sound like arguing. That arguing might sound like defiance. And defiance could turn a simple stop into something else entirely. Reed straightened slightly. His voice stayed level, but the warmth in it faded. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Marcus's chest tightened. He nodded once. "Yes, sir." He opened the door slowly and stepped onto the pavement, the cool night air hitting his face. He kept his hands visible, just like he'd practiced in his head 100 times before. Reed watched him closely, as if waiting for something Marcus didn't know he was supposed to do. The road stayed quiet. No cars passed, no witnesses, just the hum of the cruiser and the soft chirp of insects somewhere in the dark. Marcus stood still, heart beating louder than he wanted it to. He told himself the same thing he always did. Stay calm, follow the rules. This will pass. He didn't know that the choice he had just made was already reshaping everything that came after. That was the moment the line was crossed, not by anger, but by fear. When the neighborhood turned quiet. By the time the sun came up, the story had already decided what it was going to be. Marcus was no longer a man who had gone to work and tried to get home. He was a phrase, a headline waiting to be written, a face frozen on a screen while other people chose the words around it. They kept him in a small room at the station, painted a tired off-white that made time feel thicker. The bench was hard plastic. The air smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. No one raised their voice at him. No one touched him. That somehow made it worse. An officer stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes drifting over Marcus, as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be heard. "You understand why you're here," the officer said at one point. Marcus looked up. "I understand. You're holding me." "That's not what I asked." Marcus lowered his eyes again. "Yes." The officer wrote something down. The sound of the pen felt louder than it should have. Down the hall, someone whispered Officer Reed's name. Not as a fact, as a loss. The word dead moved through the building without ever being said to Marcus directly. He felt it in the way people avoided his eyes, in the way a different officer brought him water without speaking, in the way the room seemed to shrink around him. Officer Reed had died during his shift. That sentence had already been practiced by the time it reached the public. Across town, cameras arrived before understanding did. News vans lined the edge of Briarwood Glen, while residents watched from behind doors that did not open. Reporters spoke into microphones with practiced concern. An officer was fatally injured overnight during a traffic stop. A local man has been taken into custody. The footage that played behind those words showed Marcus stepping out of his car. Just that moment. No context, no sound, just a loop of him turning, hands visible. The image paused at a frame that made his posture look uncertain. Suspicious, one commentator said. Uncooperative, another added. Ruth Carter learned all of this without anyone ever knocking on her door. She found out when her phone stopped ringing from friends and started ringing from strangers. She stepped outside that morning to take out the trash and felt the shift immediately. The quiet was heavier now. Intentional. Mrs. Lowell across the street waved, then stopped herself halfway through the motion and turned back inside. A man Ruth had known for 20 years crossed the street rather than pass her on the sidewalk. At the corner store, the clerk avoided eye contact while ringing her up. "You doing okay?" he asked, but his voice carried the weight of an answer he was not prepared to hear. "I'm fine," Ruth said, because that was what people expected. Back at the house, she sat at the kitchen table and watched the morning news replay the same clip again and again. Her son's name was said with caution. The officer's name was said with reverence. She noticed how the anchor paused before saying, "Marcus Carter." How the camera always returned to Officer Reed's photo. How the word alleged wrapped itself around one man but not the other. Ruth turned the television off. At the station, Marcus was moved to a holding cell. It was clean. Quiet. The bars were cold against his shoulder when he leaned back. Another man sat across from him, eyes tired, hands clasped together. "They always look at you like that," the man said softly. "Like you already did it." Marcus didn't respond. He stared at the floor and tried to remember the sound of his son's voice, tried to remember the feeling of walking into his house after work, tried to remind himself that he was still the same person he had been yesterday. But shame crept in anyway. Not because he believed he was guilty, because he could feel himself being separated from everything that had once made him normal. A guard walked by, glanced in, then looked away. No bruises, no blood, just suspicion thick enough to breathe. Marcus rested his hands on his knees and waited, unsure what he was waiting for anymore, when the neighborhood turned quiet. By afternoon, the neighborhood no longer whispered. It retreated. Ruth noticed it when the mail truck rolled past without stopping. When the porch across the street stayed empty, the chair turned inward, as if the house itself had decided to look away. Even the children who used to cut through her yard on their way home from school took a longer route, their laughter fading somewhere down the block. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. The phone lay face down beside her. She didn't need to see it to know what it was doing. At noon, the local station ran a new segment. The headline had shifted. Officer killed during routine stop. Suspect remains in custody routine. Suspect. The anchor spoke slowly, carefully, as if every word had been approved by someone who would never have to live with it. A panel of talking heads filled the screen, discussing procedure and policy, never once saying Marcus's name without a pause. A graphic appeared behind them, a blurred still frame of Marcus standing beside his car. The image had been cropped tighter this time. His hands were no longer visible. Ruth stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. "That's not how it was," she said to the television, her voice cracked. "That's not how my son stands." She turned it off again, harder this time, and leaned against the counter, breathing through the sudden pressure in her chest. She thought of calling someone, anyone, then realized she didn't know who would answer. Friends who used to check on her every week had gone quiet. The church group chat stopped buzzing. A woman she had helped babysit for years sent a single message that morning. "Thinking of you. Stay strong." Nothing after that. Ruth understood what it meant. Support without proximity. Sympathy without risk. At the station, Marcus was finally allowed to make a call. He dialed home from memory. The line rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He didn't trust his voice to sound the way he wanted it to. A public defender stopped by briefly. Young, polite, overworked. "We're still waiting on full details," she said, flipping through a thin folder. "Right now, they're saying you're being held pending review." "Review of what?" Marcus asked. She hesitated. "Everything." Marcus nodded. "Am I being charged?" "Not yet." Not yet felt heavier than a yes. After she left, the cell felt colder. The other man had been moved. Marcus was alone now, the echo of footsteps passing by, like reminders that time was still moving. Just not for him. He replayed the night in his head over and over, the tone of Reed's voice, the way the questions shifted. The moment silence stopped being neutral, he wondered how it had been explained in reports, which words had been chosen, which pauses had been interpreted. He wondered if Officer Reed had a family, if someone was sitting at a kitchen table somewhere, staring at a photo and asking how this could have happened. The thought made his stomach turn. A guard stopped in front of the cell, peering in. "You okay?" he asked, without waiting for an answer. Marcus met his eyes. The guard looked away first. That evening, the neighborhood lights came on early. Porch bulbs glowed, but no one sat outside. The street felt staged, controlled. Ruth stood at the window, watching shadows move behind curtains, watching people live their lives quietly, deliberately, without her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail she didn't recognize. She listened. "Mrs. Carter, this is Channel 7 News. We're hoping you might be willing to share a few words about your son. The community wants to understand." Ruth deleted it halfway through. She sank into her chair and pressed her palms flat against the table. She felt small in her own house, like it no longer belonged to her, like it had been claimed by something larger. At the station, Marcus lay back on the bench and stared at the ceiling. The lights hummed. His shoulders ached from holding tension too long. He thought about Jamal, about the rules he had taught him, about the careful voice he used when explaining how to move through the world. "Don't argue. Keep your hands visible." He wondered if those words had protected his son tonight, or if they had taught him to disappear quietly. A voice echoed down the hallway. Someone laughing, someone else telling a story about Officer Reed, about his years on the force, about how good a man he was. Marcus turned his face toward the wall. The shame settled deeper then, not because he believed the story being told about him, but because he could feel how quickly it had replaced the one he had lived his entire life trying to write. Outside, a police cruiser rolled slowly through Briarwood Glen. Lights off, presence felt anyway, the system checking itself, recording, remembering. Ruth watched it pass and felt something close around her chest, tight and final. She didn't yet know what the next days would bring. The questions, the scrutiny, the waiting. She only knew that the quiet had arrived, and it was not the kind that ever leaves on its own. The weight of being presumed guilty. The letter from the city arrived on the third day. It was thin, official, folded with the kind of precision that made it feel rehearsed. Ruth opened it at the kitchen counter, reading each line twice before the words settled into meaning. Marcus Carter was being placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. This was not a disciplinary action. This was standard procedure. Standard procedure felt heavier than accusation. She sat down slowly, the paper trembling in her hands. For years, that job had been Marcus's anchor. It paid the bills. It proved reliability. It was the quiet evidence that he belonged to the routine of the city like everyone else. Now it had been paused. Not taken, just set aside, like him. At the station, Marcus heard the news from his attorney. She sat across from him in a small interview room, jacket still on, phone buzzing intermittently on the table between them. She did not look surprised when she said it. "It was expected," she explained. "They don't want any perception issues." Marcus frowned. "Perception of what?" She met his eyes. "Public opinion matters." The phrase landed wrong, too casual, too final. "I haven't been charged," Marcus said. "I know," she replied, "but this isn't about charges. It's about narratives." Narratives. As if his life had become a draft being edited by strangers. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Right now, you need to understand something. The facts might help us in court later, but outside of that room, people have already decided who you are." Marcus stared at the table. He thought of the careful way he had lived, the rules he had followed, the way he had tried to stay invisible. "What do I do?" he asked quietly. "For now," she said, "you wait. And you don't say anything to anyone, especially the press." As if silence hadn't already cost him enough. Across town, Ruth learned what the press looked like up close. They started showing up before noon. One car at first, then two. Then a small crowd that lingered near the sidewalk, cameras resting against shoulders like weights. A woman with perfect hair knocked on the door. "Mrs. Carter, we just want to hear your side." Ruth didn't open it. A man called out from the curb, "Do you believe your son is innocent?" Ruth stood behind the door, heart racing, trying to understand how a question like that could be asked so easily. By the afternoon, neighbors stopped pretending not to notice. Some watched with pity, others with curiosity, a few with something colder. Ruth felt exposed in her own home, as if the walls had thinned overnight. At school, Jamal learned the story before anyone explained it to him. He heard it in whispers at his locker, in the way two boys stopped talking when he approached, in the way a teacher hesitated before calling on him. At lunch, he sat alone. One of his friends slid into the seat across from him, eyes darting. "My mom says I shouldn't hang out with you right now," the boy muttered. "She says it's complicated." Jamal nodded, pretending it didn't matter, pretending he didn't feel the room pulling away from him. When he got home, he asked his grandmother, "Did Dad do something bad?" Ruth pulled him into a hug before answering. Her voice was steady even when her hands were not. "No," she said. "Your father is a good man." Jamal pressed his face into her shoulder. "Then why is everyone acting like he's not?" Ruth closed her eyes. Back in his cell, Marcus stared at the wall, the words public opinion replaying in his head. He had believed the system was built to be neutral, impersonal, fair if you respected it enough. Now he could feel its weight pressing down from all sides. Not loud, not violent, just constant. He realized something then that unsettled him more than fear ever had. The system did not need to hate him. It only needed to decide he was acceptable collateral. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breath shallow. For the first time since the night of the stop, the thought formed clearly in his mind. There might not be a way out that left him whole. The weight of being presumed guilty time stopped moving forward and began pressing inward. Marcus felt it, most at night. The holding cell grew quieter after dark, the station settling into a rhythm that no longer included him. Footsteps passed less often, voices dropped lower. The world outside continued its routines while his narrowed to a bench, a wall, and the echo of his own breathing. When his attorney returned the next morning, she carried a different energy, tighter, more cautious. "They're reviewing body cam footage," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Dash cam, too." "That's good, right?" She hesitated just long enough to answer honestly. "It depends on who's watching." Marcus leaned back, the metal bench cold against his shoulders. "So it's not about what happened." "It never is," she said quietly. "It's about how it plays." That night, the news cycle shifted again. A former colleague of Officer Reed appeared on television, speaking with solemn certainty about the dangers of the job. Clips of candlelight vigils played beneath his words. Photos of Reed in uniform, smiling beside fellow officers, filled the screen. Marcus's name followed shortly after, always paired with words like alleged, involved, under investigation, never neighbor, never father, never employee. At Ruth's house, the reporters did not leave when the sun went down. They rotated, fresh faces, same questions. One of them shouted as she took out the trash, "Mrs. Carter, do you condemn violence against police?" Ruth froze. "I condemn lies," she said before she could stop herself. The microphone surged forward. She retreated inside, heart pounding, locking the door with shaking hands. She slid down against it and stayed there, listening to the muffled voices outside until they finally faded. Inside the house, Jamal sat on the couch staring at his phone. His screen glowed with messages he didn't open, group chats he'd been removed from, comments he pretended not to read. "Grandma," he asked softly, "are we in trouble?" Ruth crossed the room and sat beside him. She placed a hand over his, feeling how small it still was. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said. Jamal nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. Children understood more than adults like to admit. He could feel the shift. The way teachers spoke more carefully, the way his name now carried something extra with it. At the station, Marcus overheard two officers talking outside his cell. "They say the guy didn't even resist," one muttered. "Doesn't matter," the other replied. "An officer's dead." Marcus closed his eyes. That was it. The math he could not escape. One life weighed against another, one uniform tipping the scale. He realized then that neutrality was a myth he had been raised on, that the system he trusted did not stand in the middle. It leaned, quietly, consistently. No one told him this growing up. They taught him compliance, taught him tone, taught him posture. They never taught him what to do, when. Those things failed. The isolation settled deeper. Friends did not call. Co-workers sent brief messages they never followed up on. Support came in the form of distance. Marcus pressed his forehead against the wall and exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tightening in his chest. It felt harder to breathe lately, like the air itself had rules he didn't know. He thought about the advice he'd given Jamal, about the certainty he had spoken with. Follow the rules, and you'll be safe. Now he understood the flaw in that promise. Rules did not protect you from perception, and perception did not require proof. As the night wore on, Marcus remained awake, listening to the hum of the building around him. The system did not announce its judgment. It didn't need to. It simply closed in. And for the first time, Marcus Carter could not see a clear path forward, only the narrowing space of what was left. The system didn't break. It worked exactly as designed. The truth did not arrive with a confession. It came in fragments, files, timelines, procedures read aloud in rooms that smelled like paper and stale coffee. No dramatic moment, no villain raising a hand and admitting guilt, just systems talking to systems. Marcus sat in a small conference room across from his attorney and an internal review officer he had never met. The officer spoke in a neutral tone, as if explaining a billing error. There was no direct command to fire, the man said. No verbal order, no intentional escalation. Marcus waited for the rest. His shoulders stayed tense, bracing for something worse. What happened, the officer continued, was a sequence. Dash cam activated. Body cam flagged elevated stress markers. Proximity sensors triggered. Officer Reed's biometric monitor crossed a threshold. Automatic protocols engaged. Backup units notified. Weapon unholstering logged. Tactical response status updated. A pause, then the officer said it. The discharge occurred during a system transition. No single human decision can be isolated. Marcus stared at the table. So nobody chose it, he said. The officer adjusted his glasses. The system responded. Something inside Marcus shifted. Not relief, not anger, something colder. So it wasn't an accident, Marcus said slowly. It was procedure. No one contradicted him. The officer closed the folder. The system functioned as designed. That sentence followed Marcus long after the meeting ended. In the holding area, his lawyer finally spoke without professional distance. They'll say it proves there was no wrongdoing, no intent. Marcus nodded once. Because intent belongs to people. She watched him carefully. What are you thinking? That it didn't need intent, he said. It just needed me to stay quiet. That was the realization. Heavy and unmistakable. Marcus had believed silence was neutral, that keeping calm would keep him safe, that by not escalating, he was protecting everyone. Instead, his silence became a blank space the system filled for him. No resistance logged, no verbal objection recorded, no disruption to protocol. Compliance translated into confirmation. They did not see a man trying to survive a moment. They saw a scenario that fit the model. Later, alone in his cell, Marcus replayed the night in his head, his hands on the wheel, his voice steady, his choice to say less instead of more. He had believed silence was humility. Now he saw it for what it was inside a machine. Silence was efficiency. Ruth learned the truth through a brief phone call. Marcus explained it carefully, slowly, so she could follow. So nobody ordered it, she said. No. And nobody stopped it. No. She was quiet for a long time. Then they'll say it wasn't anyone's fault, she said. Yes. Ruth exhaled, a sound full of years and weariness. Then how do you fight something like that? Marcus didn't answer right. Away. He thought of Jamal, of the lessons he had passed down without meaning to, of how many generations had believed survival meant staying small. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I know one thing. What? Silence doesn't keep you safe, Marcus said. It just keeps the system comfortable. Ruth said nothing. She didn't need to. For the first time since the sirens faded, Marcus felt clarity cut through the fear. The system had not failed him. It had done exactly what it was built to do. And now that he understood that, the question was no longer how to survive it. The question was how to be heard without becoming another acceptable outcome. Some costs are paid, even when you're innocent. The word they used was cleared. Not innocent, not exonerated, cleared. It arrived in the form of a statement read by a city spokesperson behind a podium, framed by flags and carefully chosen language. After an internal review, no criminal liability has been assigned to Mr. Marcus Carter. No apology followed, no acknowledgement of what had been taken. Marcus watched it on a small television in a quiet room at the station, his lawyer beside him. She waited for him to react, to smile, to breathe easier. He didn't, because even as the words scrolled across the screen, he could already feel what hadn't come back. His job was under reconsideration. His name was associated with an ongoing incident. His file would remain flagged for reference. The lawyer said, "This is as good as it gets." Marcus nodded. He believed her. Outside reporters gathered anyway. The story had shifted tone, but not direction. Headlines softened, but didn't disappear. Man cleared in officer's death. Questions remain. Community divided. Marcus stepped past cameras without speaking. Silence again. This time, not out of fear, but exhaustion. Ruth was waiting at home. She had folded the blankets, boxed the photos, wrapped dishes in old newspapers. The house no longer felt like shelter. It felt exposed. "They'll never let us live here again," she said, not angrily, just stating a fact. A neighbor waved from across the street. The wave was polite, distant, like someone acknowledging a stranger they once knew. That night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table long after Marcus went to bed. She stared at the place where her faith used to sit. It wasn't anger that filled the space. It was emptiness. "I believed them," she said the next morning. "All my life, I believed if we did right, they would too." Marcus didn't argue. Jamal asked fewer questions now. He packed his backpack quietly. He didn't talk about school anymore. When he did, it was about logistics, about schedules, about when they were leaving. They sold the house below value. Too much attention, too many memories. The day they left, Marcus stood on the porch one last time. He touched the railing his father had fixed years ago. He looked at the street where he had learned to ride a bike, where he had taught Jamal to throw a football. None of it felt like home anymore. There was no victory speech, no sense of justice restored, only survival. Marcus understood then that innocence did not erase impact, that the system did not refund what it took, that even when the truth surfaced, it arrived late and incomplete. The price had already been paid, in trust, in belonging, in the quiet belief that doing right would be enough. As they drove away, Ruth stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. "They didn't break the law," she said softly. "They broke us." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. Some costs were paid even when you were innocent, and some losses were never meant to be recovered, only carried. The line still exists. Marcus did not become an activist. He did not raise his voice in anger or stand on stages demanding justice with a clenched fist. When people invited him to speak, he hesitated. When cameras asked for statements, he declined more often than not. What he did instead was quieter. He told the story the way it lived inside him, in community centers, in church basements, in classrooms where students sat with crossed arms and guarded eyes. He stood without notes, hands relaxed at his sides, voice steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had learned how fear sounded when it went unheard. "I didn't fight," he would say. "I didn't run. I didn't raise my voice." People leaned forward. "I followed every rule they taught me, and it still wasn't enough." He never named Officer Reed with bitterness. He never spoke of revenge. When someone asked if he hated the police, Marcus shook his head. "Hate makes things simple," he said. "This isn't simple." He spoke about systems, about procedures that moved faster than empathy, about decisions made without faces attached to them. "Nothing broke that night," he told them. "That's what scared me the most." Sometimes a young man would ask, "So what should we do if it happens to us?" Marcus paused every time. He never rushed the answer. "I don't have a perfect one," he said honestly, "but I know this. Silence didn't save me." The room usually went still after that. Ruth attended a few of those talks. She sat in the back, hands folded, listening to her son speak with a calm strength she hadn't known he carried. She no longer trusted institutions. That trust was gone for good. But she trusted truth. Jamal came once. He sat quietly, older than his years now, watching people listen to his father with the kind of attention that hadn't existed when it mattered most. On the drive home, he asked, Do you think things will change? Marcus thought about it, about how systems resisted change unless pressed, about how memory faded faster than pain. I think they can, he said, but only if people keep asking the right questions. That was what he left behind every time. Not blame, not rage. A question. If the system answered so quickly, Marcus would say, why didn't it protect us sooner? There was never an answer offered, only silence. The heavy kind. The kind that made people uncomfortable. The line still existed. Invisible. Quiet. Waiting. Marcus understood now that crossing it did not require violence or anger. Sometimes it happened in stillness, in obedience, in fear mistaken for safety. And once it was crossed, the response was immediate. Not human, not personal, permanent. Some lines were crossed once, and the system answered forever.